to try and get there before it was too late. And so we spent 3 days, and it rained the entire time. But the final shots, we were up on a hill, and I had to run all the way down the hill and through water up to here to get to where Bruno was. And everything was pouring with rain, everything was sodden. And my flashlight wasn't bright enough, so they hooked me up to a power pole. And there were about 9 stagehands paying out this great big wire, and they'd wired all the joints and everything. And they kept reassuring me that if anything broke, I'd be electrocuted instantly as soon as I hit the water. It was one of the most terrifying evenings, and it was dark. Oh, it was terrible. But I was really hooked up. So.
Speaking of terrifying.
Yes.
Well, not terrifying, but challenging venues was the old theater in Winnipeg, leaky roofs and all. And
yeah, that was another theater I recall several in my lifetime where you'd have to put 2x4s down between the dressing rooms below stage because there'd be about 2 inches of water all the way along. And it was a lovely old theater. It was one of those old legit houses, and it was next to it was a great big building where we had the theater school and a small studio theater, and so it was very homey. I can only put it that way. And of course, it was a very in company, all people who'd worked with John since they were young. And I was one of the first outsiders to be invited in. Because even Gordon, of course, who was there the year before me, of course, he was in Winnipeg, I believe, originally, and I think he'd done a tour of the Four Poster or something the year before. We didn't meet until much later in Toronto. But
so he had left by the time you
yeah, he'd left, and then at some point I did a couple of radio shows with him, and when he was out here doing, I think it's Love Letters, he did as a duo for Bastion Theatre after I'd retired from Bastion. But I got together and had a lovely get-together with him, bought his book, and wrote a big note. We've been missing one another across the country for the last 30 years.
Were you in there in '62 at the MTC?
Yeah.
So you would have been there when Douglas Rain and Ted followed?
Yes, yeah.
Can you maybe talk about their time there?
Well, Ted I didn't act with directly. I saw him in a lovely production of Waiting for Godot that he came out and did with Eric Christmas. Douglas Rain, of course, I'd known him from Stratford, and Zoe Caldwell. And of course, I played Douglas Rain's father in that production of the Playboy of the Western World. Which isn't a huge part, but it's a nice, juicy character part. And Douglas Rain was lovely as Christy Mann and Zoe Caldwell, who I'd become very friendly with at Stratford. She's very easy to know if you are on the right wavelength with her. And so we had a very pleasant time, and she was brilliant in that. And of course, she's being brilliant right now on Broadway again. Playing Callis.
The MTC did some provincial tours. Did you partake?
Yes, I directed a production of We Must Kill Tony, which toured throughout the province. It's a little mystery play by the playwright who wrote the original Avengers series. It's that kind of black, strange comedy, and Ed Stevenson and David Bedard was out from England, so they played the brothers who were trying to bump off their sister who is going to inherit their castle. Anyway, we toured it all around the province.
What are your memories of that tour in terms of audiences and locations?
Well, locations were weird. Audiences were very friendly, of course, everywhere, but we had strange things. We had beautiful sets, but they were built for touring. But at one point we had to fly to Lynn Lake and take off on ice. This was in the middle of winter. And they had to saw all the struts that held up the sets in half in order to fold it all up and get it into the plane. And there were only 5 actors involved. And they had to take the actors up there. But one of the big props was a candelabra with 5 great candle things, and it weighed about 200 pounds. But it was a very urgently needed prop. And the decision was made that we had too much weight on the plane to take off, so we left our stage manager behind and took the candelabra. He kidded me about it for years after. He says, I suddenly discovered how unimportant the stage manager can be. And then when we got up there, we had to borrow bits of wood and hammers and nails and get the set back up again so that it would function, and then take it all apart to get it on the plane to fly back. And once when we were driving, I used to very often drive, one of the fellows drove the truck with the scenery in when we were on ground level, and he and I said, well, I'll drive back with you to Winnipeg. It was after the final performance, and it was in the middle of the night, and sleety and slushy and miserable, and he was so tired by then, he fell asleep at the wheel, and we went right off the road. Thank goodness we weren't coming through the mountains. We were on the prairies, and there we were suddenly in about 1.5 feet of slushy snow in the middle of somebody's field with a truck full of scenery. I cannot remember how we ever got out of there.
But you did.
We did.
It was from there that you decided, and maybe we could talk about the Bastion now. I think it's important we talk about the Bastion because it was obviously a significant part of theatre in Victoria, and how it came about and why you decided to tackle it.
Well, it had been, of course, my dream always to have my own theatre, and my kind of theatre was based partly on the Pasadena Playhouse, which I won't go into, but it was one of those all-round things with theatre school, student theatre, professional theatre, everything part of the same theatre centre. And of course that was the great appeal of going to Winnipeg and working with Hirsch and Hendry, is that it was a true theatre centre where you did 5 or 6 adult productions, 2 or 3 children's productions, had a theatre school, toured the schools, because along with the adult tour of We Must Kill Tony, of course, our first school tour was with Martha Henry, Donnelly Rhodes, Heath Lamberts, and Gary Files, who were all just out of the National Theatre School, and John had met them all there. So there I was, directing a tour of Shakespeare plays with these 4 marvelous people, just at the start of their careers. And but you see, there was that total concept, and of course I came to Victoria to do exactly that with the Bastion Theatre. And I knew a number of people here, and Ann Adamson, who was the head of the community programs branch at that time, with Laurie Wallace, who was provincial secretary, who I'd also known a long time ago. You have to know people. Anyway, she called me in Winnipeg halfway through the second season when I was running the school and the tours, and said, look, McPherson has died and has left $1 million to restore the old theatre where he used to work when it was Totem Theatre, after it was the York Theatre, after it had been a Pantages Theatre. Said, why don't you come out and get the thing organized? There's 2 years before the Playhouse will be ready. So I thought, yeah. And so I did. I told Hirsch I'm not coming back for a 3rd year, and I've got to try this. I said I'd have a theatre by the time I was 40, and by then I was 38. So I thought, well, time's getting short. So I came out, and thanks to, again, Anna Adamson locally, and a number of teachers in town, and Audrey Johnson, who was the critic for the Times in those days, who I'd known, they called a big meeting and had sherry and cheese, and I explained the whole thing, and that we weren't out to kill the community theatre, we just wanted to have an overall theatre centre, and build a company that would be professional enough by the time the MAC would open in '65, and we would be working toward a full equity company, but not immediately. So that's the way it went, and somebody introduced us to a little church, which isn't far from where the Belfry Theatre in Victoria is, and we rented it for $100 a month, and lived in the basement, 3 of us, who'd followed me from Winnipeg, and performed up in the church. We'd do adult shows on Thursday, Friday, Saturday nights, kids shows Saturday afternoons, theater school during dinner hours and Saturdays, and the school board was very cooperative and put out all the information to the schools, and we took out a duplicate, really, of the tours I'd been doing in Winnipeg to the schools here using local actors. And it just sort of built up, and eventually we opened the MAC in '65, and I stayed on until '75 when Ed Stevenson took over as artistic director.
Was it true that Sam Payne lent you $100 to get
Yep. Yeah, I called Sam and I said, we need $100 for the first month's rent, and Sam gave me $100 and never got it back. I don't know where the books are for 1963, but the first thing in the books is the Sam Payne loan. But I did, thank goodness, he was over and played the lead. We used to get small Canada Council grants to bring in a guest performer or a guest director long before we got a sustaining grant. And so the first one I applied for was a grant for Sam to come over and play the lead in Life with Father, which he did. And then he came over and directed several productions after that.
Was there, how exciting was the opening night? Was it, did you come to this,
well,
you had your own theater, and now here's opening
well, the opening night wasn't a Bastion production. It was something much more confusing. They wanted a huge community show to be produced involving every organization in the city. Choirs, the Victoria Symphony, 3 of the ballet schools, 4 amateur theater companies, the University Players Club. And so I devised this script, which was a kind of a history of theater. We did things from the Greeks up to, Taming of the Shrew, School for Scandal, and things like this, and various musicals, just excerpts from them, all linked together. There were 170 people involved, and I think it's 37 groups in dressing rooms that held about 39 at the most. They used to dress across the street and be brought over, say, okay, such and such a number's on. As they're leaving, you come over and get ready for your scene. It's coming up in half an hour. It was an enormous thing to organize. But the city put up $10,000, for which Bastion produced it. I directed it. Well, I consolidated. Each group had its own director, but I'd go around to the various companies in town and watch what they were doing and say, no, could you cut that down and so on, and after that you come such and such a thing. It was a heck of a thing to get together, but that was the opening of the MAC. It was called Lights Up, and the theater had been dark for 10 years. And we got a young actor named John Sparks, who had been a backstage kid in his teens when Totem was here, and he was now a professional actor. So he was the one paid actor, and he came over, and he was the linking person who came on stage at the beginning, and the whole stage was empty, and said, I remember when I was 14, and I used to try and pull the curtains here and so on, and then voices would come, and then slowly props appeared, and it all went its way. And was even stranger because the guy who was running the MAC at the time, Robert Ellison, who I was responsible for having them hire, decided that he didn't think it was professional enough. So he hired Elsa Lanchester, Charles Lawton's widow, to come to do the opening night. And we went on the second night. And of course, she bombed because nobody wanted to see her do a one-woman show about Charles Laughton at the opening of the McPherson. And it was really sad. We were setting up our scenery. I'd never met her. I'd met Laughton years ago. And she came out of her dressing room, and we were all setting up our stuff on the stage. She said, well, it's quite obvious that you're what Victoria will want tomorrow night. And walked out. I thought, what a sad meeting with this wonderful lady who'd been just roasted in the press. Not that she was bad. It just was the wrong thing. But he'd been telling the City Hall we wouldn't be ready. And the City Hall believed it. And of course, when they saw our show, they kept saying, you wouldn't be ready on time. I said, we were ready. Bob just didn't want the local group to be the first. So they fired him. Ha ha ha.
And now what year was that?
That was 65.
So from 63 when you founded the
Yeah.
company,
We worked in the church and toured and had our theater school and did studio productions and sort of got everybody wired up, ready to do big shows.
you did you even design costumes for the Shakespearean Festival?
Yeah, that was, of course, that was a lovely combination with the university. Carl Hare at that time and Roger Bishop were the main forces at the beginning of the Phoenix Theatre period. And Carl, I didn't know him personally until I got here, but he'd worked with Holiday Theatre and so on. So they came up to the church and we had a long chat. He arranged for me to do some evening classes in directing out at the university. It's always tricky for me to work at universities because I didn't go to university and don't have a degree, but he arranged this, which was a little money in the pocket for me. Then he said, well, we're going to do this Shakespeare 64 in the summer. How about putting all your forces into it with our university students, which was wonderful. And I directed Richard III and designed it. And my mother and somebody made all the costumes for $150. And I had a number of our actors that I'd worked with, plus I auditioned student actors at the university, out of which people like Larry Eastick, who is still the technical director for the MAC, and Art Penson, who became our designer and is now a designer in Ottawa. These guys were all playing in Richard III, and of course they were all graduating that year, so they all came down to the church and became part of the Bastion. So I suddenly had designer, technical director, all these people. If it hadn't been for that wonderful town and gown situation, I wouldn't have had enough people to do what we did. It was just miraculous the way it all fell together at that time. And we all still keep in touch and have reunions, even though a lot of us are spread all over the country.
65 was also the year that you joined forces, I guess, so to speak, with Butcher Gardens and so on.
Oh, yes. Yeah, well, we'd done, we were going to do The Boyfriend the next season. I think that was it. And so Mrs. Ross and Ian Ross, who ran the Butcharts, and their son, who was crazy about theater and was going to be anyway in The Boyfriend as a dancer actor, they said, well, would you do children's theater for the summer and do our Just for Fun show in the evenings for the tourists? So we managed somehow in between the 2 seasons of plays at the MAC to put together a big musical review plus 2 children's musicals, and they built a beautiful sort of 14th century pageant wagon, the kind you see in old books, in which the curtains opened and the doors opened out and stairs fell down, and it became a little theater on wheels that could travel around. And so we performed all summer there, 3 productions.
There was the Box of Smiles, I guess?
Yeah, which was written by John Hirsch, of course. And a composer from Winnipeg, his Ukrainian Concerto Symphony is so famous. But anyway, he'd written the music for this, and John Hirsch had written the script. And so we did that. And That was our summer kids show that summer, yeah.
Since we're only going up to 1970, the first 5 years or 6 years of the Bastion, I guess.
Yeah.
What stands out in your mind as some of the achievements that?
Well, I think it was the fact that with a very small staff, who were very often not only working in the office but also acting, it was very Totem-like still, and for very small pay, that we managed to, build up a theater school with about 100 students, 125 I think it went up to at that time, on all levels from adult to 6, then be able to tour not just around here, but we would tour the Okanagan and down into the state of Washington with plays for both adults. No, not only once we did it for adults. Mostly it was a high school show plus a elementary school show. And you see, it was marvelous because our company at that time, most of whom are now professionals, were young people about to become professionals. And they'd be out on tour through the fall. They'd come home, do a big musical like Camelot or Over the Rainbow, Oliver, things like that. And then they'd go back out on tour, come back at Easter, do another musical. Then we had a deal, again, one of those wonderful LIP grants that existed around that time, where we were able to then perform down in the city squares for free using the same actors. So they were going 12 months of the year. Their pay wasn't big, but they were doing 8, 9 performances in different shows, musicals and straight plays, and touring children's theater, adult theater, as they all keep saying. God, what a training ground. Ross Petty, of course, who's married to Karen Kane, and he produces a great deal of shows of his own, and has had quite a career in Vegas and France, and did Sweeney Todd across America. He was from Winnipeg, was in the chorus of a show I did there, came out here, auditioned, and ended up a full season and got his equity card here. And he still says, I had a 3-page resume just from that year at Bastion, which got me jobs for the rest of my life. He said, where can you get that experience today and actually earn enough to eat and have a room?
That's great. I think you maybe have covered it, but one of the things that you talked about this all-encompassing philosophy of the school.
Yeah, right.
Was that what basically? It says something about following Tyrone Guthrie's idea that you should have a local add variety. So
right.
That was sort of what you.
Yeah. Well, I'd watched him at work too, but I'd also heard him speak, and I think I'd probably read an article. I think when he was getting the theater started in Minneapolis, the Guthrie Theatre, I think he wrote an article where he said, the thing is to have a continuity in which you've got a company, and then every year or two, 3 or 4 members of the company leave, and you bring 3 or 4 new people in, and then maybe they'll go and do all kinds of things and come back 2 or 3 years later as other people leave. So there's always freshness to it, but at the same time, there are people who understand what its roots are and stay. They don't pack their bags and come for 3 weeks and leave. It becomes part of their life, and he felt this was the ideal thing, so that it never became inbred, but it did have a family group concept, and it seemed to me to be the healthiest thing in the world. And we were constantly going through that. They'd come and audition for Charlottetown. All of a sudden, Bill Hosey and Don McManus, who had been here for 2 years, went off to Charlottetown, and we were missing our tenor and our bass and one of our directors, And but we kept finding new people, and it kept working. But then as things got tighter, as they did, and going union, where the expenses were much, much greater, and the rules did not permit some of the hours that we were quite happy to spend. Suddenly, of course, Ed Stevenson found he had to cut down to 4 productions instead of 7. Then the Children's Theatre went, and another group that I'm involved with took over that area. And then the theatre school eventually went, and the tours all vanished, so that it's a little disappointing as with the fact that it's still in trouble financially here in 1995. Well, the trouble started in '88 when it had to go dark for 2 years. That it basically is lucky if it gets 5 co-op shows on in a year, in which 3 or 4 of them are not necessarily even produced in Victoria. So it's a very different situation than the dream that one had. And I haven't talked to anybody. I did talk to Tom Henry, who was here. Bastion did a production of his play about 17 Miles of Broken Glass this spring, and saw Tom Henry for the first time in many years. But we were talking a lot about it, and he says that, of course, you know, Winnipeg isn't the center that inspired you to start Bastion, and very few places can work that way anymore. Maybe one day it'll come around in a circle again, I hope.
I hope so too. Well, how are we doing for time, Darren?
4 minutes or 3.5 minutes.
Well, I think that's probably a good place to. I mean, I could go on forever, but.
Yeah, I probably could too.
Okay.
In 5, 4, 3, 2.
Well, Yvonne Firkins was very important. Apart from the production of Light Up the Sky that she did in her own little arena theater up on Broadway prior to the Totem days, she had initiated the Arts Club on Seymour Street. A lot of people don't realize that it existed. We used to go and do play readings there. Professional actors, we'd donate our time, and Yvonne would direct us, and we'd do these play readings of plays that had not yet left Broadway and that nobody was producing. And it was a meeting place for actors from all around Vancouver. And this was Yvonne's concept that eventually turned into the Arts Theatre. And of course, the little old club has now gone, but there are now, 3 or is it 4 theatres down on Granville Island? But they were all the inspiration of Yvonne, who was also a very important director and member of the Theatre Under the Stars, which a lot of people forget that she directed a number of shows there. And as a stage manager in those early days with Yvonne, she was one of those remarkable directors who could design things. And she would come with me. No other director would bother to go with the stage manager. She'd come with me and select the materials to decorate the set with and things like this, and come down with her staples and thumbtacks and help me put it all together to make it look just right. And her apartment down on the West End was just covered in bolts of material. And this was her. She could be hard as nails, but by golly, she wanted everything to be perfect. And she'd work down to the last moment with the crew to make sure her shows were beautiful. And I found that a wonderful experience to find an older director. I mean, she was in her 60s then, white hair. When I was a kid, and there was this wonderful lady with her stapler and her hammer saying, "Here's how you do it, kid." So that was Yvonne, and I think she's been very much neglected in people's memory because so much happened afterward.
So was she there at the beginning of the Arts Club, or did she just sort of the motivation behind it?
No. Well, I think she found the place. As far as I know, I don't remember anybody there but Yvonne Firkins. I think she found that place and initiated the readings and got some permission for a liquor permit or something, or at least a coffee shop. And we'd sort of get together there and have coffee or sandwiches and do these readings for the public. I think the array, it was just a little platform in a room with about 40 chairs. But another lady with a lot of inspiration.
And the Arts Club down in Granville Island now, was she at any point involved in that part?
No, she was dead by then.
Right.
Awful to say it.
Oh.
Well, she was, again, one of the reasons I started working on the book, because she had just died when I heard all this palaver about what happened in the theater. I thought, my God, people like Yvonne, I'll never be able to speak to them again. And that's really what geared me to try and say, let's get this in the archives. If we can't get it into print, somebody will one day.
Okay, that's great.